I've been teaching for 15 years, and I'm fortunate as a U.S. history teacher that tomorrow I'm going to go off on a sojourn to the past, and we're going to be going to the Deep South for 10 days, you know, because when one looks at the state standards, you know, you mention civil rights, there's not a lot of depth there, you know. The textbook, it's the same thing, you know, you kind of hit a couple of highlights, but there's no real depth, there's no real understanding. It's kind of a soundbite history, it's small bits of history that are easy to digest. Dr. King makes the I Have a Dream speech, everybody can feel good about that. But you won't get anything about Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was the hero of Birmingham. John Lewis might be mentioned. However, other players like Reverend Clark Olson would never be mentioned in a U.S. history textbook. The McNair family and their loss, they are not mentioned. Like Vernon Dahmer, who is just this heroic man who is absolutely nowhere in these textbooks. There's always the infamous picture of Elizabeth. You don't really learn anything about her. You don't learn the struggle that she went through. And of course, they might mention the Little Rock Nine, but one of the folks that we spent a lot of time with on the trip is Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, and she is never in the history book. She has not mentioned. All this is unknown history, and it's not easy for all of us to face that. That's the history of this country.
10 seconds. Okay, here we go. Dr. Lewis, if you come over here. This side, you have 30 seconds. Begin. Hey guys.
The struggle, segregation, discrimination, coming out of slavery, and the problems that we've had being accepted into the total society as first-class citizens, particularly here in the South, is not documented in the history books as far as I've seen.
Some of the social problems we have are really only going to be solved when we look at ourselves. And that's a real key here. That's what this whole trip is going to be. You're looking at us. We're looking at ourselves when you go on this trip. This is a scary, scary trip. It's going to be so hard for you.
If you go into like Brooklyn or the Bronx or any of those public schools, you'll see that they're very segregated. And I guess that was the whole debate with the Brown versus Board of Ed. Are we really an integrated society? And I think it was clear from that debate that we're just as segregated as we are in the 60s.
Every freaking year I gotta go through the whole, you know, some student comes up to me, you bombed Pearl Harbor. This is, you know, that kind of, no, I hate to say that I'm used to it because that makes it sound like I've accepted it. I thought that, you know, America as a people were beyond that point, but obviously we're not, you know? Even now, I've got it from teachers and stuff. I was in an English class one time in middle school, and it was just friendly banter back and forth between the teacher and me, you know? We got a little heated argument and stuff, and he goes, just remember who won the war. You know, and no, at that time, you know, I was, you know, just a stupid middle school kid, you know, I just, you know, kind of brushed off my shoulder, like, oh, okay, you know? But then I, you know, got to thinking about, like, you know, why does he have to even, you know, bring that up?
My name is Mr. Steinberg. I take high school students into the deep south of this country, retracing the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s. You meet people who had relatives who were murdered fighting for freedom. If you choose to come with us, you meet people who were beaten fighting for equality. Any questions? Allison, Stephanie, Daniel, ladies and gentlemen, look at the thing at the bottom. Bravo, I need John Lewis questions if we have them, or the Minnie Jean assignment. Let me share with you, I only want to do this one time. Rules. If a boy steps his foot into a girl's room, or a girl steps her foot into a boy's room on this trip, you will be on the next flagpole. Cannot go into each other's rooms. Questions about that? There are no drugs or alcohol on this trip. If you are doing drugs or drinking or anything like that, you're subject to be arrested. We don't want to call the police, bail you out. Don't want to do that. One-way ticket home the next day is $1,800. Sojourn will not pay for it. Next one, there's obviously no smoking on this trip. You may not smoke. There are no cell phones. There are no Walkman, MP3 players. You may not sag on this trip. We will ask you one time not to sag. Your parents need to be pulled up on this trip. Women, you need to be appropriate on top and on bottom. That means your shirts, and I don't want to be the shirt police. Arm above your head, your shirts staying down below your waist. You know, I know they don't make shirts that fit women. I understand that. If you sleep as we are teaching, I'm gently going to go up to you and say, "Excuse me, Whoopi, I need to keep you back." And nobody paid all this money to come on this trip to stay on a bus and sleep. So you need to stay awake. You can help each other do that by elbows to the ribs if you see your friend drifting. Do whatever you can to help them stay awake. Questions about that? Those are the rules. I think they're all really fair. But of course I do. I told you I made them up.
I can recall my mother used to take me downtown to, get my school clothes or whatever. And we had to go in the basement, what we call Pizzitz's bargain basement. We weren't allowed, as blacks, we weren't allowed up on the upper floors. We weren't allowed to drink out of the fountains. I recall one time we caught the city transit bus, and I remember my mother leading me by my hand, paying her fare through the front door and then exiting the bus, going to the back door and getting on board, where we were cramped like sardines in a can. And the front half of the bus, or should I say 3/4 of the way of the bus, was fairly empty. So, those memories are still vivid.
One side of my family is Jewish, and the other side is Russian. My dad told me that my grandpa's family was all shot in front of his eyes. But I mean, the people who done it are, dead already also. I mean, and their grandchildren, they have nothing to do with it. Because people look at me, they don't know my history. They don't know where I'm coming from, the fact that my family was from Russia, once you're white, they automatically think, you're white, you're American, or whatever. They have the whole mentality of Americans being white. And so, therefore, they assume that you were involved. Therefore, they assume that that's the way you think. They used to have, all those stereotypes as others. And it's just the color that makes you feel kind of guilty. That you look the same way that the people in those documentaries and movies look like, who were doing those things.
White students have no guilt in this. This is not about guilt for anybody. I want to be really clear here. As we go through this, it's about understanding. It's about knowing the history, where we're at today. But our students, and I want to be really clear here, every white student in here has no guilt nor shame in any of the stuff we are discussing. But it's going to be certainly a different way to think than you might be used to.
And we don't deal with it that much because what happens is it's painful for black people and shameful for white people, so we just kind of put it under the rug and don't deal with it. The only way healing can take place is to take it from under the rug and put it on the table and deal with it.
Please don't carry the burden of your culture group on your back. It's way too heavy, okay? Like, one of the things that sometimes happens is saying, well, I'm defending my group. It's way too heavy to carry. We're not asking you to do that. You cannot speak for an entire group. So that means that, does that make sense?
Racism is the ism that we're focusing on for this session. And bringing out the institutional part of racism.
Prejudice based on skin color does not become racism until you add social, political, economic, ideological, and institutional power.
One thing that I don't want you to lose, okay? Don't lose from the individual to the institutional.
Segregation was all made legal in 1896 because an African-American man in Louisiana by the name of Plessy was forced to move from a first-class car in a train to another car in the train where blacks were. He sued Louisiana saying this law was wrong, I had a first-class ticket, I should be able to sit here, and went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled thus infamously that you could have separate but equal facilities. So now it's constitutional. Once it said this, then everything can be segregated in the South, and not only in the South, but in the North or out here in the West in California too, because once the Supreme Court says something is constitutional, that's it.
Racism in that sense, is not just a black and white issue. You could hate somebody just because you hate somebody for whatever, if they're black or they're Jewish or they're Catholic or whatever. But when the government sets a standard that says it's okay, separate but equal, that institutionalizes it. That makes it okay throughout, and it legally makes it okay.
You've studied this with Little Rock. It's in your lesson.
Discrimination, prejudice. We have that in one area, but we have racism supported by the institution in a different area. We're separating the two out.
One of the first questions that comes up is, what about reverse racism? Prejudice hurts no matter who it's directed to. And it's an individual act against individuals. But we're talking about a bigger body of power.
Brown versus Board of Education. In that decision, Thurgood Marshall argued that separate was not equal. The court agreed, and the court then in Brown versus Board of Education said, dismantle the separate but equal education, so now students of color can go to school with white kids. And it didn't happen. Because even though the Supreme Court said that, people said, no one's going to come to my local community, no one's going to come in my town and tell me that my clean little white girl is going to go to school with these Negroes.